It's round 6 of the Crypto Cup, and the absolute matchup of the day was Alireza Firouzja versus Magnus Carlsen. Now, in the rapid play games, they won one each, drew one each, so that meant that they went to the Blitz portion, and in the first Blitz game, Magnus won with the white pieces. Alireza made a pretty horrible decision to give up his bishop pair, and Magnus just steamrolled it from there essentially. So we came into this game with Alireza being in a must-win situation with the white pieces here. So let's see what happened. He kicked off with e4 and Magnus goes c5. We saw this in the rapid play and we go down this Rossolimo line here. So with the bishop here coming to b5 straight away, and Magnus goes for this e5 move. And what we'll see is that the structures actually become a bit more akin to what you might see in the Roy Lopez structures, e4, e5 games. So we had castles here, and now this weird looking move, bishop to d6. Now c3 was played, a6, the bishop drops back, b5, and then this bishop comes to c2, knight g7, and one thing I want to point out here, if white goes for an immediate d4, which you can do, well then at least this bishop finds a bit of life, something like this. You have now opened it up, although still black has a pretty horrible pawn structure, but they're going for some piece play around that. So this is one way where that weird looking bishop might come to life if white goes d4 immediately, which isn't a bad way to play, but instead Alireza just plays this a bit more slowly. So he goes rook e1, castles, a4 nibbles away at this pawn structure on the queen side, rook b8 defends. Now we had d3, and this is the point. Alireza's not breaking out here, he's just slow playing the position because black's got a bit of a traffic jam here, so it's not such a bad way to play at all. So knight g6 was now played, and Magnus is clearing room for this bishop to retreat. Then he's going to push the d-pawn, he can develop the light squared bishop. So bishop e3 played, bishop e7 nudges back, this knight developed, d6, now Alireza takes on b5, he opens the a-file for his rook, and he goes bishop to b3 here, so he's stopping an immediate f5, also putting pressure on this d5 square, where he then might come and hit this knight, and so Magnus goes bishop to e6. That's such a powerful piece, he has to challenge it, and Alireza goes bishop d5, plonks it on this really nice central square, and you don't want to be capturing here immediately, or then the knight's forced out to a5, b4 could come, and whether you chuck in an exchange here or not, the knight's going back to b7, and it's on this horrible circuit here, nowhere to go, not what you want to be doing. So we didn't have takes on d5, instead queen d7 not only defends the knight, but also gives it a square in some future lines. So rook a6 was now played, excellent move, activating, pressuring the knight, and now here Magnus changes the pawn structure. So he does take on d5, pawn recaptures, knight d8, looks a bit miserable, but he wants to go f5, get some attack going, and then the knight could come to f7, maybe e5 one day if you ever go e4 at the right moment, etc. So it has some life, a journey to go on. Queen b3 now from Alireza, excellent move, eyeing down to the king, and you can start with king to h8 here, get out of those x-ray attacks, but Magnus actually just goes for an immediate f5. I love the way both players just really fight in this game and in the whole match. So Alireza now has a tactic, because your immediate thought as white is, well, what happens if I take here? And sure enough, Alireza does. And after pawn recaptures, he pushes on with check. Now it's all very, very tactical here, because it looks like you can block the check with c4, and then you're actually going to be winning this queen, etc. But what Magnus had missed here is that Alireza has this beautiful tactic. If you want to pause and look for it, please do so here. So after pawn to c4, Alireza goes knight c4. This is what Magnus had missed, because after pawn recaptures, now he picks up this rook on b8 here. This is the trick. So he's doing well in this position now. The bishop is attacked, but first we had knight f7, opening up the rook, and Alireza invested a lot of time here figuring out the right way forward. In the end, he went for this queen b4 move, is a good move. He looks at this pawn, puts pressure, so we had takes on d6 by Magnus. You couldn't really save that pawn as white. Now we had takes on e5. You know, the knight on f7 just left that defense. This one captured, rook retakes, Magnus chops here, but queen d4, excellent move, coming in front of the pawn. You're going to be rounding it up, and you can't move the knight anywhere, or your queen's actually dropping off. So rook d8 played, defends the queen. We had takes here, and now the best shot here for Magnus to really complicate things was to keep the queens on. So queen b7 was his best move, pressuring this rook. It's not quite on prise yet, putting pressure on the pawn, opening the rook, or opening the rook here, all that sort of stuff. But he didn't go queen b7, knight e4 was played, and now the queen's come off. And this is a very difficult endgame, especially after this next brilliant move, pawn to g4. So you deal with the back rank issues here, and you also put pressure on this knight. You can't take, you lose the piece. And here Magnus just really randomizes the position. So he goes pawn h5 here. Now you can take either pawn with a good game here. Technically taking this one is better, but Alireza takes this one, also looks good. The knight now has to move. It comes to g5, and this is really Magnus's idea. Well, he's looking to check, but also when the king covers that, he wants to run this h-pawn, get it here if he can, and start to box in that king, create checkmating threats. So pawn h3 from Alireza, good move. Now the bishop came to f6, the rook came back to e2, Alireza wants to cover, and long term he wants to get these c-pawns running. This is why these connected pawns are giving him such a good game, and he's better here, because often you would think of the two minors as better versus the rook, but not in this position. So rook d5 played, this pawn's dropping off, but now these pawns get going. The pawn drops, b4, now rook f4 pressures this one. We had a defense from c6 by the rook. Knight f3 played, looking to fork, but Alireza ignores it because when the fork comes, now we check, king moves, then you move the rook here. So Alireza's holding it together. Can Magnus stop these pawns? The knight comes to c2, and now watch out, because when Lawrence Trent was covering this with Peter Lecco, he goes, okay, rook f3, and he said it obviously quickly, he's just analysing fast, but if you do that one, trying to exchange too hastily, bang, knight e1 check, you've just blundered the game, you lose. So this is where it's so tough, because the guys are just on increment here. You know, Alireza's on very low seconds, as we can see, but he sees it. He drops the rook to e2, knight d4, now the rook slams down here, now knight f5, and here Alireza's best move actually, I think, was pushing the pawn. Yeah, c5 here would have actually been best, but he gets spooked here. You know, there are a lot of pieces around his king. He just comes back with the rook, saves some time, and okay, he's not damaged the position. It's fine. Bishop to d4 played, pressuring here. Rook e2 covers, now knight d6, hits the rook, it moves away, knight f7 played, and now b6. The pawns are really rolling, and here Magnus basically has to give up a piece to stop them. So he goes knight e5 to start with, the rook jumps away, and now after takes on b6, this knight's actually just dropping off. But really, whatever kind of construction you tried to set up as black, you had to give a piece to stop those pawns. So we had c5 from Alireza, Magnus takes. Now you've got a choice of which piece to take. Alireza chops this one, the knight hops to d7, and now rook g5. Excellent move, because you're preparing rook g4 to trade, kind of forcing the trade, or else this pawn drops off. So king h6 was played, rook g4, trade here, pawn recaptures, king g5 attacks this pawn, and now it's not actually so straightforward here. Now, if you go king h3, you make it look very straightforward, because this knight's a bit short of squares, the king doesn't have moves, or the pawn drops. Say the knight comes to f6, looks very, very natural. Well, now you could actually check like this, for example. If the king drops here, well, we pick up the pawn, you know, just an easy technical win. And if the king steps forward, well, we check, king goes, f3, etc. Pawns then dropping once again. Good game for white, you know, easy conversion. But when the king doesn't step to h3 here, instead we had a step to f3 from Alireza. Now there's a trick in the air, because king f6 was played, and now something like king e4 would be the best move here, preparing to roll the pawns, connect them, etc. But after this move of rook a2, which Alireza played, looks very natural, because you want to start giving these lateral checks, all this kind of stuff. Now he runs into knight e5 check. Massive issue. You can't step the king to g3, of course, it's covered. So Alireza comes forward to hold the pawn, but then there's g5 check. He has to give away, and now he's losing a critical pawn. This actually turns it from a won position into a drawn position here. Now he gives up on this pawn, as we'll see. If you try and actually save it, so we have rook a6 check, king g7. If you try and save this pawn now, say with f3, well, you're just kind of delaying the swap off of pawns. You know, you might have to go f4 here, or at some point these pawns are going to get exchanged off, basically. You can't avoid that one. So instead we had king f5 immediately. Alireza gives up on it, but he knows he's going to recoup these ones, and then maybe in the slimmest of outside chances, he can win a technically drawn endgame of rook versus knight. So we see this play out now. The knight's attacked, it retreats, rook a7 check, king h6 steps up, another check, king into here, the rook swings back, threatening mate, but Magnus simply steps back here, and after check, king g7, rook h5, now Magnus actually moves the king, and in a moment he reactivates his knight here, as we'll see. So the knight now comes to f4, the king gobbles up here, the knight comes to d5, king f5 played. Eventually we're going to see this pawn drop off the board, but now the knight is back around the king, excellent defender, and there's just nothing Alireza can do. So these were the final moves of the game, some notional checks, you know, the rook running around, but you just can't do anything here. There's no way to checkmate the king with that defensive piece. So this was the final position. The game was drawn. Magnus clung on. Alireza just threw away the win in that endgame, unfortunately, and Magnus takes the match. So tomorrow we'll see Prague chasing Magnus. I think those two are playing, yeah they are. And Prague needs to actually win in those first 4 games to win the whole tournament. Otherwise Magnus takes it if it goes to the Blitz section, tie breaks, or if he obviously wins the match, then he will win the tournament too. So very tense, exciting day to come. Thanks very much for watching, and I'll see you soon.